Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining Dr. Hannah Fry and I this afternoon. The intelligent future and kind of how brands engage, or how consumers, engage with your brands through these kind of changes of technology is our topic this afternoon. Data has shown us some really interesting trends as to sort of how consumer behavior is changing. And we're going to dig into some of that in just a second. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Fry. Dr. Fry is a lecturer in mathematics of cities at University College London. She's an author. She's also a renowned BBC presenter. But before I do hand over to her, I just wanted to talk to you about the weather. We're British. We should always talk about the weather in every presentation. This was one hell of a summer for weather, 2018. It was hot. I think we all had a number of nights lying there, looking or listening to one of these, deciding, is this enough, or should we actually go online and finally buy that mobile air conditioning unit? Only to find that, when you did make that decision, that there are only crap ones left online, and it wasn't worth it, and this weather was going to break in a week anyway. So that was one of the big things of the summer of 2018. The other thing was the CO2 crisis, where all of the CO2 manufacturers across Europe decided to service or close their plants throughout the course of the summer, which meant there wasn't enough CO2 to kill all the animals in abattoirs, so there was a backlog of animals going there. There wasn't enough CO2 for pubs, for pints. There wasn't enough CO2 for drinks manufacturers of fizzy drinks. And most importantly, there wasn't enough CO2 to deliver ice, and therefore there wasn't enough Frappuccino in Starbucks. So, third world problems. It was a tough summer. It was also the summer of the World Cup in Russia. Who can forget the roller coaster of emotions that we all went through this summer? So, we had this. We saw a bit of this. There's a lot of teeth going on this summer. So we had our highs, and then clearly we had some of our lows. It led to this, ultimately led to this, and finally to this. But at least we got further than we normally get. So, it was definitely a positive improvement. It was also the year where I think more beer went on the floor than actually got drunk. So there was this new phenomenon of every time that England scored, we would throw beer up into the air, which was good because there was a drought, and clearly it was good for Hyde Park and the grass. But, what a waste of time. You queue up for half an hour to get a beer, you score, you throw it in the air, you've got to get back in the queue again. So anyway, it was this new phenomenon of throwing beer in the air. Talking of beer, and this is really where I just wanted to get into a little bit of data just to kick this session off. We work as Yext with a number of bar chains within the UK, pub chains. So one of the things that we did during the World Cup is we looked at the data of how people were engaging with these bar chains. So if you don't know what Yext does, we hold data on brands, on customers, which we then push empirically correct across all the digital ecosystem. So that if you're looking for a bar near me, or a Tesco near me, or something near me, or you're looking for a specific beer or product or service, you can find that by having all this data in one place and then being pushed out across Google, Apple, Instagram, etc. So what we did here is we started to look at how consumers engaged with some of these bars throughout the course of the tournament. We saw some interesting stuff. So first of all, what you see on the left-hand side, and I'll explain this pretty quickly, and I've got more detailed stuff if you're really interested and you're into football and consumer engagement here. But this was just sort of normal. So you would see in the week people engaging with pubs, searching for pubs. Are they open? What do they serve? Do they serve food, menu line items? Midweek, peaks at the weekends, back to midweek. What we then saw as we went through the tournament is that engagement peaked at the quarterfinals. So this is where we saw about 3 times the level of engagement where consumers are looking for a pub near me. Do they have a TV? Do they have beer with the CO2 crisis? And it was happening the day before as people were planning where were they going to watch the game. So it peaked at the quarterfinals. And then the next big one was at the semi-finals, which funnily enough was not quite so big, but people were then taking actions the day before, they were calling, they were clicking on driving directions. The other thing that we saw is that there was a massive uptick in people leaving reviews around these locations at these events as well. So there was nearly double the level of reviews left about these pubs during the World Cup, around the semi-finals particularly, and the average rating went down to 3.9, whereas before the average rate was 4.1. So whether that's because they were sick of getting covered in beer, or whether it was just the emotion of losing, and then you're going to blame the facility or whatever it was. So we saw more reviews, but we saw disengagement across some of these locations. So why do I share this? Consumer engagement and the way that we are kind of engaging with brands is changed rapidly. And the big thing that we've seen is the way that we actually engage in search now. It used to be that we would go to a website to find out information about a brand or about a business. And these days, as consumers, there are so many different places we can now go to find out about a business. The data that I was pulling there on the World Cup pretty much came from Google data. But you go to Facebook, you go to Bing, Foursquare, Siri, Yelp, all of these different places. And what we see is about 73% of people searching for things around me actually go to these places and never end up on a website. And now when we're searching for things, instead of having 10 blue links and having to interrogate our way through to find the information we're looking for, these days we get direct answers. So very quickly, it's the day after a World Cup game, I've got a hangover, and I go, "Hey Siri, where's my nearest pharmacy?"
The closest one I found is Boots on Redriff Road. Do you want that one?
I don't know if you could hear that, but basically what it's giving me now is direct answers, and it's giving me one direct answer. It's not giving me choices. So actually, if you're not that brand that's being presented at that point of need, you're kind of invisible to me. The next thing that we've seen is clearly there's so many more of these places where people are engaging for information around the brand. And the final thing I just wanted to cover off here is the way that these intelligence services work. So they pretty much all work the same. So whether you're talking about Google Maps or Uber or Siri or Alexa, they've all got three elements in the way that they work. The first one is the UI. How does it actually deliver an answer? The AI, which is the brains that determines what is the answer I'm going to give. And the third one is the knowledge graph. This is the information that sits underneath the data that then allows these intelligent services to give these direct answers. And there is just so much complexity around how people are engaging and searching that it's really important to have all this data in one place being fed consistently so that actually consumers can get what they want at that moment of intent. So my final slide, why is this important? And then I'm going to hand over to Hannah. This is now what consumers expect. It's what we expect. We expect when we are engaging with a brand or when we're engaging with technology for these things to be empirically correct. We expect when we get in our Uber and we put drop me outside Harrods front door that we get dropped outside Harrods front door. If you are a Chinese tourist walking down Regent Street looking for Burberry, you're not on Google Maps, you're on WeChat. And you expect that that data will be consistent in there and correct in there. And that's the thing. Consumer expectation now means that there's this big change, and actually data has a lot to play in understanding consumer behavior. And that's why I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who's going to give us some more great insights around that data, how to then determine what's going on and what that means for consumers. Hannah.
Yes, indeed. So my name's Hannah Fry. I am actually a mathematician at University College London. And I thought I'd give you a bit more of a mathematician's perspective on data and just how much value you can extract from your data when you're prepared to dig a little bit deeper. And I thought to kick us off, I'd give you just a really small example of what I mean by digging deeper. And it's an example that actually begins with a little game that was created by a teenage Wikipedia user a few years ago. Now, this game's actually very, very simple. All you do is you go onto any Wikipedia page and you click on the first link on that page that isn't in a bracket and isn't in that little disambiguation bit where it says maybe you've gone to the wrong page. And then you repeat, okay? Now, it doesn't sound like the most fun game, but let me give you a little example of how this works, okay? So let's say that you start off at the Wikipedia page for mathematics. Here is that page. The first link on this page is quantity. Click through to quantity. That will then take you through to property. Click through to property, and you end up getting to philosophy. Okay, nothing particularly interesting so far. But now let's imagine that you start off another Wikipedia page altogether. So let's say that you start off at the Wikipedia page fact. Fact will take you through to experience, and then experience will take you through to philosophy again. Well, that's weird. But it turns out, if you play this game, you don't just end up getting to philosophy for vaguely sensible Wikipedia pages. Wikipedia pages like egg also have this pattern. Here is the series of links that you need to follow to get from egg all the way down through to philosophy. Even Wikipedia pages that you had no idea existed, right? Like death from laughter, which incidentally is just a list of famous people who died while laughing, worth checking out. That will also, via this series of links, end up taking you down to philosophy. Now, I really wanted to prove to you that this is a phenomenon that you will find when you play around on Wikipedia. So I spent quite a long time trying to think of the one Wikipedia page that would be as far away as possible from philosophy. And I think I found it, because it turns out that this phenomenon even works for the Wikipedia page for One Direction. Here are the series of links. But my favorite thing of all time, to get from One Direction to philosophy, you've got to go through E. coli. Which particularly amuses me. But now here's the reason why I wanted to start with this example. This was just a random quirk of the internet that someone had discovered, until another Wikipedia user took a data dump of the entire Wikipedia network and set up a script that would crawl through and collect up all of the statistics. And they discovered that actually for 97% of Wikipedia pages, if you play this game, you will eventually end up getting down through to philosophy. And the vast majority of other pages there are just red links or dead links. Now, for me, this example is the very perfect illustration of the way that I try and see the world as a mathematician. Because on the surface level, you've got these kind of statistics. But for me, it's almost as though you have these two universes that are running in parallel. On the one hand, you've got the real world, the tangible world that you're existing in when you're clicking around on Wikipedia, not noticing any of this stuff going on behind the scenes. But lying underneath that, you have this data-driven world, a world in this case which is all of those networks of pages and sources and syncs and links and hubs that ends up giving rise to this phenomenon. But this really is a world that you can only really explore if you're willing to use lots of mathematics. Now, that's not to say that thinking about things superficially, thinking about sort of the very top-level data can't give you an awful lot of insight. This is one of my favorite examples of what I mean by that. This is some data that is from the dating website OkCupid, and what it tells us about who we are. Now, OkCupid is actually quite an interesting dating website because they are completely open about the fact that they experiment on their customers. So in one section of their website, what you're allowed to do, you're allowed to rate how attractive you think other people are on a scale between 1 and 5, right? So 5 there is very beautiful. 1 is slightly more facially challenged, I think is the technical term for it. And this is the data for how men on OkCupid rate women, okay? Now, actually, if you look at this data, it's sort of what you would expect, really. I mean, you've got your averages in about the right place. You've got nice tails on either side. Ultimately, I think what this graph is telling us is that men just fancy women, really. That's what this is saying. Compare that, though, if you will, to the same graph for how women rate men on OkCupid. You see something subtly different, subtle shift. In fact, actually, the women on OkCupid are so fussy, they will only give 1 in every 6 guys an above average attractiveness rating. But we will still go out with you, so this is definitely not a problem. Absolutely fine. But this is, quite sort of top-level data. The more intricate that your data becomes, the more intricate your insights can become. So this here is an example from my lab at UCL, some work that we did looking at the bike share scheme across London. So what we did is we set up a script that would go onto the official website, and it would download the data for how many bikes were in each stand across the city, and it would do that every 3 minutes until it built up this really beautiful kind of data set, this really rich picture of how the city looks. So on this visualization that was made by my colleague Ollie O'Brien, each one of these dots represents a bike stand. And the size of the dot tells you how many bikes are in that stand, and the colour of the dot tells you how full that bike stand is at that moment. And you can really see, I think it's almost like the city takes a breath in the morning as everyone floods into the centre, and then kind of breathes out in the evening as everyone heads home. But the thing is that having this kind of data set, this is just the start point. This is the point where you can start to dig a little bit deeper and try and uncover a bit more about human behaviour. And in particular, one thing I wanted to show you is something that you discover when you look at one bike stand, at what happens across the course of a day for one single bike stand. So this here is the data for Waterloo, and you notice something a little bit unusual. Because you might think that London was big enough that these bike stands should be emptying and filling up quite smoothly. You'd expect that these kind of curves would be relatively smooth. But actually, that's not what you're seeing. You're seeing these very dramatic spikes that appear in this data, almost as though a huge load of people come and take a massive load of bikes away all at once, or vice versa. Now, when we first found this in our data, we thought that maybe we'd made a mistake. After all, we were collecting this data ourselves. So what we did is we repeated the analysis for the Paris bike share scheme. We tried to repeat the analysis. And actually, we found that the same pattern appeared in Paris's bike share scheme. But Paris really held the key for us, because you would only see spikes in the data for the bike share scheme in Paris for the bike stands that were at the top of a hill. So essentially what was happening was that people will quite happily hire a bike and cycle downhill, but nobody ever wants to do the return journey. So as a result, the people who are running this scheme have to drive around in trucks, pick up all the bikes from the bottom of the hill, replenish the stock at the top of the hill, and that's when you see a big spike in the data. Now, in London, what you're seeing here is it's whenever it rains, basically. No one ever wants to cycle in the rain, which means that the bikes are then in the wrong place in the city the next time the city sort of takes its breath. So now if you look out for them, you'll see these trucks driving around, kind of replenishing the stock all across the city of London. But these are always my sort of favourite examples, where you have this really rich data set, and that's the starting point where you can begin to ask much more interesting questions. And this, I think, is probably one of my favourite data sets of all time. This here is a visualisation of every element of transport in London over a 24-hour period. So it's just about 4:30 in the morning now on this visualization, but every red dot that appears on this screen is the location of a bus moving around. Every green dot is a train, every purple dot is a tube, and those of you who are at the front might just be able to see the Woolwich ferry in blue kind of going backwards and forwards across the river all day long. Now, once you have this data, once you have this kind of mathematical view, if you like, of your city, that's the point when you can start asking more interesting questions. Like, for example, where in that city is the worst place to have a problem at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Monday? And actually, it turns out that the answer is not one of the big stations in town like you might expect, right? It's not Waterloo, it's not King's Cross, it's not, Victoria. Actually, the worst place on that map to have a problem at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Monday is Highbury and Islington, which is a much smaller station in the northeast of the city. Now, the reason for this is that an awful lot of trains end up going through Highbury and Islington during the morning. So if there is a problem there, you have potentially tens of thousands of people who are stuck and need an alternative way to get into town. But unlike those stations in the centre of town that can accommodate those extra people, that extra capacity, Highbury and Islington has only got one tube line, right? If there's a problem there, there's only really one other tube station that's within walking distance, which is Angel Islington, which itself only has one tube line. Around that area, there's hardly any buses. There's no taxis really that go past. There's no bike share scheme. Plus, you're too far away from the centre of town to just walk. So when there is a problem there, you have these huge numbers of people with hardly any options remaining to them. So what they end up having to do is flood those remaining options, causing a problem there, which causes another problem and another problem and another problem. It's known as a cascading effect that travels down through the network. But the point really that I wanted to make here is that it's only by thinking of your city, of your system, through this lens of kind of data and a bit of mathematics that you can really even ask these kinds of questions. And these are where the really interesting stuff is, where you look for the anomalies, you look for the outliers, and sort of pick those apart. And that, I think, is where you often reveal a lot of insight into how we're behaving. There's a very famous example of this that starts with this data set here. So actually, I changed my mind. I think this is my favorite data set of all time. Okay, so this data here, this data is the ratio of baby boys to baby girls that is born in England and Wales over the last 170 odd years or so. So you've got time along the bottom, and up the top you've got this ratio. Now the first thing to notice about this graph is that it's not 50-50. Slightly more boys are born in England and Wales than girls. And the second thing to notice is that this is a ratio that changes over time. So there's three very definite peaks on this graph here. You've got one there in 1919, of course, just after the end of the First World War. Another peak there in 1945, after the end of the Second World War. And another big peak there in 1973, which was another big year for Britain. So we had miners' strikes, 3-day week, all of that kind of thing. Now, it's not just in England and Wales that you see this pattern, that at the end of a war or a very big year for the country, there is a spike in the number of baby boys that are born. Actually, if you go pretty much anywhere around the world, you'll find a very similar pattern. And this is an anomaly that has been known about for a really long time. So there were some interesting early theories as to why this might be the case, what's causing this. I think my favourite theory as to why this might be the case is that at the end of a war, God is trying to replenish the male stock in the country, and that's why you see this pattern. Strangely, doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny, that particular idea. The actual answer, the actual reason why you see this pattern in your data is, I think, something much more interesting. The reason why you see this pattern in your data is because it turns out that when a woman conceives during her cycle, subtly changes the chances of her conceiving a male or a female child. So ever so slightly earlier, ever so slightly more likely that she'll have a male child. Now, this is way too tiny. These probabilities are way too tiny to see at the level of an individual woman. But if you scale up to the size of a population, you can start to see this pattern emerge. So essentially, what we're seeing here in this data is that at the end of a war, all the soldiers come home. Everyone's very happy. People have lots more sex than normal. Women get pregnant slightly earlier. And as a result, you have a spike in the number of baby boys that are born. Now, I know that 1973 wasn't the end of a war, but I think we know what everyone was doing in the 3-day week. Now, the reason why I wanted to tell you this is because actually it turns out that the same is true for cows. Not that cows are kind of going off to war, but that the chances of a cow conceiving a male or a female calf subtly change depending on when in that heat cycle that cow conceives. Now, in cows, it's the other way around, so ever so slightly earlier, ever so slightly more likely to be female. And of course, if you're a farmer, it's much more profitable for you to have your cows pregnant at all times, as much as possible, that's what you want, but you also want them to be pregnant with female calves. And if you have a big enough herd or expensive enough cows, it starts to make sense that you would want to try and play these probabilities. There's only just one problem, which is that heat in cows only lasts for about 18 hours. So this window is really tiny. And cows are notoriously secretive about when they're going into heat. So the only real giveaway that a cow's gone into heat is that she'll get up and she'll go and have a little bit of a walk around the field. So it used to be the case that farmers would have to camp out overnight, look at their field and see which cows were going for a walk. But of course, now you don't have to do that because, you may see where I'm going with this, if you put a pedometer on a cow, you can detect this moment automatically. So here is a normal cow with a pedometer on, nothing, just having a lovely time wandering around. And here, for comparison, is a cow that has just gone into heat. And you can see this very clear signature that stands out right there. So if you go around the countryside now, I promise you, you will find cows wearing little ankle bracelets that's sending this data back to a central server, very simple machine learning algorithm there running, detecting this moment and alerting the farmer of that perfect moment to inseminate. Now, these ideas of detecting what's normal and then detecting what's abnormal from it and using that as an alert are feeding back through into the kind of things that we're doing as humans. So this is some data from a project in Bristol where they've set up an entire house with every kind of sensor you can imagine. I got to stay there. I was filming a documentary there. So this is me in the kitchen. We also have Xbox Connects in all the rooms. This is me filming a documentary there where they were kind of collecting my data. Now, the idea behind this is that you install these in the homes of perhaps elderly relatives or relatives who have severe depression, someone who you want to learn their normal pattern of behavior, the time of day they get up, the tea that they drink in the morning, all of those things, so that you can alert a loved one if they ever don't get up one morning or if they're not eating, anything like that. And there have been a few trials of this run by commercial companies as well as the academic projects, which this one is, which have this really nice outcome because people have reported that now rather than calling their parents and saying, what did you eat today? Did you make sure you ate lunch today? What time did you get up? Have you left the house? All of those questions. They know that the technology is taking care of it instead, so they're free to have much more human conversations about football and about Coronation Street, all of those different kind of things. The technology ends up actually making them more human, which I think is a really nice idea. Now, one just very quick thing I wanted to say on the subject of machine learning there is that I don't think we're quite at that stage where we can just hand over all of our data analysis to artificial intelligence or machine learning. I think it still needs the human hand to really guide and extract the most value from your data. And the reason for that is because I just think that we're still at a point where machines don't understand context and nuance, and for that we need humans. And this is never clearer than in the case of image recognition. Just how little they understand context and nuance. So this is some work that was done by Janelle Shane. I've repeated her experiment for you. And she realized that when you put photos into image recognition software, something rather unusual happens. This particular piece of software will label your photos for you, tell you what's in them. So here's the label that it gives for this photo. It says, a herd of cattle grazing on a lush green field. Now, I've spent quite a long time looking at this photograph, and I can definitely see a lush green field. It's very lovely. Can't see a herd of cattle, unfortunately, which makes you wonder if this image recognition software is hallucinating farmyard animals. And this is not the only case. So if you put this picture into the same piece of software, this is a Microsoft Azure software, incidentally, it says that it's a sheep standing on a lush green field. Got quite a thing for lush green fields, this particular image recognition software. Also, again, can't see a sheep. No sheep there. So really, I think the question is, does this image recognition software know what a sheep is? Well, let's test it. Let's take a sheep and put it in an unusual environment. And in this case, it thinks that actually it's a cat sitting on top of a wooden fence. If you take a farmyard animal, put them in the arms of a child, it thinks it can't possibly be real. Take them and put them in a tree, it thinks that they're birds. And my personal favourite is that if you leave them in a field but then paint them pink, it suddenly thinks they're a group of flowers, which I think probably is a slightly more sensible explanation for what's going on there than whatever we have here. So yeah, I don't think we're quite ready to hand over to machine learning altogether for data analysis. But I do also think that actually, when you combine good machine learning with very good data and the good guide of a human hand for the analysis, there are some really incredible things that you can do. So I wanted to leave you with just one story that's much closer to my own research that I do as a mathematician, which is how you can combine all of these ideas to help catch serial killers. I'm going to frame this against the backdrop of one serial killer in particular, which is Harold Shipman. This is what he said when he was arrested back in 1998. Now, just in case any of you haven't heard of Harold Shipman is the worst serial killer that we've ever had in the UK. So we know for a fact that he killed 215 people. And we suspect that he probably killed an additional 45. And the reason why we can't be sure is because Harold Shipman was a doctor. He was a GP who would kill his own patients. And that made it very, very difficult to catch him, but it also meant that an awful lot of analysis had to be done on his data, his record as a GP, to be able to prove his guilt. And one of the pieces of data that was used in his trial was exactly that, comparing him to a normal doctor. Because inevitably, if you are a normal doctor, sometimes your patients are going to die on you. It's sort of a fact of the job. Now, here is a graph of this normal doctor. Along the bottom, you've got the time of day, and up the side, you have got the percentage of patients, percentage of their patients who died at that time of day. Now, this line is a little bit bumpy, but generally speaking, it's quite flat, right? And essentially, what that's saying is that people die at all times of the day. Okay, it's not like we have a preferred time of day to die. Okay. Compare that, though, to the same graph for Harold Shipman, and you see something quite different. You see a very clear spike. And I think what's most chilling about this, actually, is when you realise what Harold Shipman was doing was acting like a normal doctor for most of the day, having lunch, and then going out in the afternoon and killing his victims. But the reason why I wanted to show you this example is actually because of this, this map here. This map here is of Hyde near Manchester, which is where Harold Shipman had his doctor's surgery. And every one of these red dots is the home locations of one of Harold Shipman's victims, the place where the murders took place. Now, I reckon I could get anyone in this room to put a cross on this map as to where you think Harold Shipman's doctor's surgery was. And I reckon all of you would get it bang on, because, of course, it's smack bang in the middle, and right next to that, a very big cluster of red dots. Thing is, if you're the police, you don't want to wait until you've got 215 dots on a map before you can work out where the source of all of those crimes are coming from. What you want is a way to extract as much value from your data as it comes in real time, and a way to help you prioritize your search. And the way that you can do this is by using a really clever little mathematical trick. All you do is you kind of turn the question on its head. So rather than looking at a map and trying to pinpoint where your killer comes from, you start at the site of a crime. So, okay, let's imagine then that there has been a serial killer, definitely all the hallmarks of a serial killer, definitely a serial killer. And you can ask yourself, okay, how far away do we expect our murderer to live from that site? And you can think of this in terms of distance, and you can think of this in terms of probability. Now, generally speaking, most murderers do not commit crimes on their doorstep. It's generally not considered wise if you want to get away with it. So the chance of finding your serial killer right next door is going to be really low, right? But as you go a bit further away, so still in the same town, the chances are going to creep up to be much higher. So all the evidence suggests that serial killers like some convenience while they're murdering. They are people too, after all. But as you go further away still, this probability is then going to drop off again. You don't have very many people sort of traveling cross country to commit murders. So what that means is you end up with a curve like this, a curve that you can spike into a map and kind of spin around in all directions to tell you where you're likely to find your serial killer. But the thing is that, with this sort of surface that you have here with that hole there in the middle around the site of the original crime, if you've just got one crime, this isn't telling you much more than common sense, but it's not kind of adding very much. Where this really comes into play is where you have lots of different crimes, where you can start to layer up these surfaces and really pinpoint where you expect your serial killer to come from. But the reason why I wanted to end with this example is because I think it really demonstrates the power of thinking about things mathematically as well as just the machine learning side. Because once you have a technique like this, there's really no limit to the kind of situation that you can apply it to. Because actually, this map here has got nothing to do with serial killers at all. This map here is tracking down the stagnant water pools that mosquitoes use as breeding grounds based on where cases of malaria have been found. You can also use this technique to track down bomb factories based on where improvised explosive devices have been found. And there's even one group who've used it to work out who Banksy is based on where his paintings have been discovered. But I think really that's the point I'd like to leave you on, because I think when you have very, very good data, really good analysis, good technology and good machine learning, as well as the guiding hand of someone who's really good at the analysis, I really think that you can extract an awful lot of value from your data. Thank you very much.